On the morning of November 19, 1967, 330 American paratroopers from the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry Regiment, began climbing Hill 875 in the Central Highlands of South Vietnam. They were elite soldiers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade, trained to jump from aircraft and fight behind enemy lines. They were confident, aggressive, ready for combat. The hill rose 875 meters above sea level, covered in thick jungle, steep slopes, and North Vietnamese army fortifications that would have looked familiar to soldiers who fought in World War I. Bunkers reinforced with logs and earth, trenches connecting fighting positions, interlocking fields of fire, an enemy regiment dug in and waiting. Over the next 5 days, those paratroopers would fight one of the most brutal battles of the Vietnam War. They would make repeated frontal assaults up slopes so steep they had to pull themselves up by tree roots and vines. They would fight hand-to-hand combat in trenches. They would survive artillery barrages, mortar fire, and human wave attacks. And on the evening of the first day, they would endure one of the worst friendly fire incidents in American military history, when a Marine Corps fighter bomber dropped 2 bombs directly into their defensive perimeter, killing 42 men and wounding 45 more. By the time they captured the hill on Thanksgiving Day, November the 23rd, 115 paratroopers would be dead and 253 wounded, nearly 60% casualties. Precisely 1/5 of the entire brigade's strength destroyed fighting for a hill that would be abandoned days later, deemed strategically worthless by the generals who ordered men to die taking it. This is the story of Hill 875. It is a story that feels less like Vietnam and more like the Western Front in World War I. Frontal assaults against fortified positions, artillery preparing the way for infantry attacks, men climbing into machine gun fire because those were their orders. And when it was over, when the hill was finally taken, the question every survivor asked was the same question soldiers asked at the Somme and Passchendaele. What was the point? The Battle of Dak II was part of what became known as the Border Battles of 1967. North Vietnamese forces launched major attacks at locations near the Cambodian and Laotian borders: Loc Ninh, Song Bay, Con Thien, Khe Sanh, and Dak To. The strategy was to draw American forces away from populated areas toward the remote border regions, fixing them in place while preparations continued for what would become the Tet Offensive in January 1968. Dak To sat in Kon Tum province in the Central Highlands, where the borders of South Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos met. It was remote, mountainous, covered in triple canopy jungle, and strategically important only because of its proximity to the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Special Forces camps at Ben Het and Dak II represented roadblocks at the southern end of the trail, and the North Vietnamese wanted them eliminated. In late October 1967, American intelligence detected major North Vietnamese troop movements in the Dak II area. The People's Army of Vietnam 1st Division had concentrated 4 regiments in the region: the 32nd, 66th, 174th, and 24th. Their mission was to capture Dak II and destroy a major American unit, demonstrating that American forces could be defeated in conventional battle. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was chosen to meet this threat. They had been in Vietnam since May 1965, the first major American combat unit deployed to the war. They were experienced jungle fighters who had conducted dozens of operations. They called themselves Sky Soldiers, and they had a reputation for aggressive action and high combat effectiveness. But by November 1967, the 173rd was not the same unit that had arrived in Vietnam. The 1-year rotation policy meant constant turnover. Experienced soldiers rotated home just as they reached peak effectiveness. New soldiers arrived straight from training, learning combat skills in actual combat rather than through extended unit training. Officers came and went. Units never developed the kind of cohesion that characterized armies where soldiers served for the duration of the conflict. From early November through mid-November, the 173rd fought a series of engagements with North Vietnamese forces in the hills south of Ben Het. On November 6th, the 4th Battalion fought for 4 hours at Hill 823, losing 16 killed and 37 wounded. On November 11th, the 1st Battalion engaged the enemy for 8 hours, suffering 21 killed and 128 wounded. On November 12th, a task force inserted onto Hill 8. 23 lost 20 killed, 154 wounded, and 2 missing. These were not small skirmishes. These were major battles with casualties that would have been considered heavy in any war. The North Vietnamese were not conducting hit-and-run guerrilla attacks. They were fighting conventional battles, defending fortified positions with regiment-sized forces, accepting casualties to inflict casualties on American units. By mid-November, American intelligence identified the presence of the 174th North Vietnamese Army Regiment on Hill 875, approximately 6 kilometers from the Cambodian border. The 174th was a veteran unit, well-trained, well-equipped, and dug into positions they had spent weeks preparing. Their mission was to cover the withdrawal of other North Vietnamese units back to sanctuaries across the border while inflicting maximum casualties on American forces. On November 18th, Brigadier General Leo Schweiter, commander of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, received reports that a Special Forces reconnaissance patrol had encountered heavy resistance near Hill 875. He ordered the 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry to take the hill. This was the decision that would lead to disaster. Schweiter was ordering a battalion to conduct a frontal assault against an entrenched enemy regiment on terrain that heavily favoured the defenders. The hill was steep, covered in jungle that limited visibility, and made tactical manoeuvring nearly impossible. The North Vietnamese held the high ground, with prepared fighting positions and pre-registered artillery and mortar coordinates. Attacking up that hill was going to be costly, but Schweiter, like many American commanders in Vietnam, believed in aggressive action. Find the enemy, fix them in place, destroy them with superior firepower. The 173rd had orders to clear the Dak To area of enemy forces, and Hill 875 was where the enemy had chosen to make a stand. So the 2nd Battalion would attack. At 09:43 on November 19th, Companies A, C and D from 2nd Battalion, 503rd Infantry, moved into jump-off positions to assault Hill 875, 330 men total. They advanced in the classic two-up, one-back formation that infantry had used since World War I. 2 companies forward, 1 in reserve. Companies C and D led the way up the slope, with 2 platoons from Company A following. The terrain was brutal from the start. The hill rose at steep angles, 40 to 50 degrees in places, sometimes approaching 60 degrees where the slope was nearly vertical. The jungle was thick triple canopy, huge trees overhead blocking sunlight, dense undergrowth at ground level, vines and vegetation making every step difficult. In some areas, the vegetation was so thick soldiers could not see more than a few meters in any direction. In other areas, the slope was so steep they had to grab tree roots and vines to pull themselves upward. Soldiers carried full combat loads, M16 rifles weighing 7 pounds, 200 to 400 rounds of ammunition, adding another 15 to 30 pounds, fragmentation grenades, smoke grenades, water in canteens, sea ration meals, medical supplies, ponchos and shelter halves, extra radio batteries for the signallers, belts of machine gun ammunition for the M60 gunners. Total weight ranged from 60 to 80 pounds per man. Climbing uphill through jungle while carrying that much weight was exhausting even without enemy contact. The heat was oppressive. The Central Highlands could be cooler than the lowlands, but in mid-November it was still hot and humid. Temperatures reached into the high 20s Celsius, and the humidity made it feel even hotter. Soldiers sweated constantly, soaking through their uniforms within the first hour of the climb. Water became precious quickly. Men drank from their canteens and worried about running out before they could refill from streams or bomb craters. For the first few hours they encountered only light resistance, sporadic sniper fire, a few automatic weapons bursts. The North Vietnamese were letting them climb, letting them get tired, letting them spread out along the slope where they would be vulnerable. At approximately 1400 hours, when the lead companies were about halfway up the slope, the North Vietnamese opened fire with everything they had. The volume of fire was staggering. Heavy machine guns, AK-47 rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, mortars. The jungle erupted with the sound of automatic weapons and explosions. The Americans went to ground immediately, taking cover behind trees and in depressions in the slope. But there was no real cover. The jungle vegetation provided concealment but no protection from bullets. The steep angle of the slope meant soldiers could not dig in effectively. They were pinned down on an open hillside, taking fire from fortified positions above them. Company D's commander tried to organize an assault to close with the enemy positions. This was standard infantry doctrine. When ambushed, assault through the ambush, close with the enemy, use grenades and close-range fire to clear their positions. But assaulting uphill against entrenched positions proved nearly impossible. The slope was too steep, the vegetation too thick. Every time soldiers tried to move forward, concentrated machine gun fire drove them back. Squad leaders tried to organize fire and maneuver, the basic infantry tactic where one element provides covering fire while another element advances. But the jungle made it nearly impossible to see where your own men were, let alone coordinate their movements. Radio communications were difficult because the terrain blocked signals. Officers and non-commissioned officers had to shout orders, but their voices were lost in the noise of gunfire. Soldiers who tried to advance uphill found themselves crawling on hands and knees, pulling themselves forward using tree roots and vines for leverage while bullets cracked overhead. Some made it close enough to North Vietnamese bunkers to throw grenades, but the bunkers were well constructed and a single grenade rarely destroyed them. You needed multiple grenades placed precisely in the firing ports. Or you needed satchel charges or flamethrowers, and the paratroopers had neither in sufficient quantity. The North Vietnamese had the advantage of prepared positions. Their bunkers were built from logs and earth, resistant to small arms fire and fragmentation grenades. Each bunker was positioned to provide interlocking fields of fire with other bunkers, so that attackers approaching one position would be hit from multiple directions. Trenches connected the bunkers, allowing defenders to move between positions without exposing themselves to American fire. This was professional defensive engineering, the kind of fortification that required weeks of labour and demonstrated the North Vietnamese commitment to holding this ground. As the afternoon wore on, the situation deteriorated. The lead companies were taking heavy casualties. Officers were being hit. Radio operators were being killed, disrupting communications. Medical evacuation was impossible because helicopters could not land on the steep jungle-covered slope under heavy fire. Wounded soldiers had to be carried downhill by their comrades, reducing the number of men available to fight. The battalion commander realized he needed to consolidate his position before darkness fell. He ordered the companies to pull back slightly and form a defensive perimeter on a small saddle in the ridgeline. This was a sound tactical decision given the circumstances, but it was also an admission that the assault had failed. They had not taken the hill. They had not even reached the main North Vietnamese defensive positions. They were stuck on the slope surrounded by enemy forces with night approaching. As the companies pulled back and formed the perimeter, the North Vietnamese launched a counterattack. North Vietnamese soldiers came down the slope in waves, firing as they advanced, some armed with AK-47s, others with grenades and satchel charges. This was close-range jungle fighting at its most brutal. Men fired at enemies they could barely see through the thick vegetation. Hand grenades were thrown back and forth. Soldiers fought hand-to-hand when North Vietnamese troops reached the American positions. Private First Class Carlos Losada, a machine gunner with Company A, held a critical position on the perimeter. When the North Vietnamese wave attack hit his section, he stood up with his M60 machine gun and fired into the advancing enemy soldiers, giving his company time to fall back and form a new defensive line. He was hit multiple times but continued firing until he was killed. For his actions, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The fighting continued into the evening. The North Vietnamese kept probing the perimeter, testing for weak points, launching small attacks that the paratroopers had to repel. Artillery support from American fire bases helped, with high explosive shells landing close to the American positions, but the thick jungle canopy meant artillery effectiveness was limited. Many shells detonated in the trees above ground, sending shrapnel down, but not destroying bunkers or killing enemy soldiers in protected positions. As darkness fell, the Americans formed a tight defensive perimeter centered on a small clearing in the jungle. The battalion command group positioned itself in the center of the perimeter, along with the most seriously wounded soldiers who could not be evacuated. Medical personnel worked frantically to treat casualties, but supplies were limited and the number of wounded was overwhelming. Chaplain Major Charles Waters moved among the wounded, providing comfort, praying with dying men, helping medics carry casualties to the collection point. Waters had been with the battalion throughout the day's fighting, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to reach wounded soldiers and drag them to safety. He was a Catholic priest who believed his duty was to be with his soldiers when they needed him most, and on Hill 875 they needed him desperately. At 18:58 hours on November 19th, one of the worst friendly fire incidents in American military history occurred. A Marine Corps, a 4 Skyhawk fighter bomber, flown by Lieutenant Colonel Richard Tabor, commanding officer of a Marine Air Group from Chu Lai Air Base, dropped two 250-pound Mark 81 Snake Eye bombs into the 2nd Battalion's defensive perimeter. The pilot had been called in to provide close air support. American forces on the ground were surrounded under attack, taking casualties. They needed airstrikes on enemy positions to relieve the pressure. The forward air controller on the ground marked the friendly perimeter with smoke grenades and provided coordinates for where the bombs should be dropped. Outside the perimeter, on North Vietnamese positions, something went wrong. The A-4 came in on its bombing run, released 2 bombs, and they fell inside the American perimeter instead of outside it. One bomb was a dud, hitting the ground without exploding. The other detonated in a tree directly above the battalion command post and the casualty collection point where the most seriously wounded soldiers were being treated. The explosion was catastrophic. The bomb detonated as a tree burst, sending shrapnel down in a cone-shaped pattern that covered the center of the American position. The command group was destroyed. Captain Harold Kaufman, the overall on-scene commander, was seriously wounded. First Lieutenant Bartholomew O'Leary, Company D commander, was critically wounded. Company A's commander had already been killed earlier in the fighting. Radio operators were killed. Medics treating casualties were killed. And the wounded soldiers lying in the collection point, men who had been shot during the day's fighting and were waiting for evacuation, were killed. Chaplain Waters was killed instantly. He died doing what he had done all day, ministering to wounded soldiers, providing comfort, refusing to seek safety when his men were in danger. For his actions throughout the battle, repeatedly exposing himself to enemy fire to rescue wounded paratroopers, he was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. 42 men died in that single explosion. 45 more were wounded, adding to the casualty list from the day's fighting. In one instant, friendly fire inflicted more casualties than hours of combat against the North Vietnamese. The battalion's command structure was shattered. Leadership positions were vacant. The men who were supposed to coordinate the defense, call in artillery support, organize medical evacuation, were dead or wounded. For the survivors, the friendly fire incident was devastating psychologically as well as physically. They had survived a day of brutal combat against a determined enemy. They had fought off wave attacks, held their positions, done everything soldiers are supposed to do. And then their own aircraft killed them. The arbitrary nature of it, the fact that they had no warning and no way to protect themselves, made it worse than enemy fire. At least when the North Vietnamese shot at you, you could shoot back. The junior officers and non-commissioned officers who survived had to immediately take charge. They reorganized the perimeter, consolidated positions, accounted for casualties, prepared for possible night attacks. They had to function as leaders while processing the trauma of what had just happened, while dealing with their own injuries and exhaustion, while knowing that the enemy was still out there waiting to attack again. The night of November 19th to 20th was one of the longest nights any of those soldiers would ever experience. Either they were surrounded by enemy forces on a hilltop in the jungle. Their battalion was destroyed as an effective fighting force. Over half the men who had started up the hill that morning were dead or wounded. They did not know if they would survive to see morning, but they held. Throughout the night they repelled North Vietnamese probes and attacks. They called in artillery support using fire from distant batteries to keep enemy forces at bay. They treated their wounded as best they could with limited medical supplies. They prepared defensive positions and waited for dawn. At first light on November 20th, the 4th Battalion, 503rd Infantry, was ordered to move out and relieve the men on Hill 875. This was the battalion's sister unit, also part of the 173rd Airborne Brigade. They knew what their fellow paratroopers were going through because they had been fighting in the same area for weeks. They moved as quickly as terrain and enemy resistance allowed. But moving through the jungle toward Hill 875 was not a simple relief march. The North Vietnamese had snipers and ambush positions covering the approach routes. The 4th Battalion had to fight their way forward, clearing enemy positions, taking casualties. The terrain slowed everything. What should have been a few hours' march took all day. It was not until nightfall on November 20th that the 4th Battalion reached the 2nd Battalion's perimeter. The relief brought fresh troops, ammunition, medical supplies, and additional command and control capability. But it also meant more men were now trapped on that hilltop. The combined force numbered approximately 570 men. They were still surrounded. They still had to take the hill. And the North Vietnamese were still dug in above them, waiting, On the afternoon of November the 21st, both battalions moved out to assault the crest of Hill 875. This was the attack that should have succeeded on the first day, before casualties, before the friendly fire, before exhaustion set in. Fresh troops from the 4th Battalion led the way, with survivors from the 2nd Battalion in support. The fighting was fierce and close quarters. Paratroopers advanced up the slope under heavy fire, using grenades to clear bunkers, getting into the North Vietnamese trench line and fighting hand-to-hand. Some soldiers made it to the enemy positions and held them briefly before being ordered to pull back as darkness fell. The hill had not been taken, but they had proven they could reach the enemy's main defensive positions. One more push might do it. That night, the decision was made to use overwhelming firepower to prepare the way for a final assault. Throughout November 22nd, American artillery pounded the hilltop. Tactical airstrikes came in wave after wave, dropping high explosive bombs and napalm on suspected enemy positions. B-52, bombers from high altitude, struck the area with massive bomb loads. The goal was to destroy the North Vietnamese fortifications, kill defenders, break their will to resist. The bombardment worked, at least partially. The North Vietnamese 174th Regiment had taken heavy casualties over 3 days of fighting. They had held their positions, inflicted severe losses on American forces, accomplished their mission of covering the withdrawal of other units. But continuing to hold Hill 875 meant accepting annihilation from American firepower. So during the night of November 22nd to 23rd, they withdrew. On the morning of November 23rd, Thanksgiving Day, 1967, American paratroopers advanced up Hill 875 and found it abandoned. The bunkers were empty. The trenches were empty. Bodies of North Vietnamese soldiers killed in the fighting lay where they had fallen, but the survivors had pulled back into Cambodia or Laos, beyond the reach of American pursuit. The paratroopers had taken the hill, after 5 days of fighting, after 115 killed and 253 wounded, after the friendly fire disaster and the repeated assaults and the brutal close combat, they had accomplished their mission. Hill 875 was in American hands. The scene at the summit was apocalyptic. The jungle that had once covered the hilltop was gone, destroyed by bombs and napalm and artillery. Trees were shattered stumps. The ground was torn and cratered. The smell was overwhelming. Decomposing bodies, both American and North Vietnamese, mixed with the acrid smell of explosives and napalm, combined with vomit and human waste and blood. Abandoned equipment littered the battlefield. Helmets, rifles, rucksacks, ammunition, medical supplies, ration containers, all the debris of combat scattered across the torn ground. The bodies of American soldiers who had been killed on the first day and could not be evacuated lay where they had fallen. For soldiers who had survived the battle, seeing their dead friends, seeing the cost of taking this hill was devastating. Thanksgiving services were held on the hilltop. Chaplain Captain John Torp, from the 4th Battalion, conducted services in the confusion of brush and branches that remained. Soldiers came forward to receive communion, exhausted men with mud and blood on their uniforms, some wounded, all traumatized by what they had experienced. Thanksgiving 1967 on Hill 875 was unlike any Thanksgiving those men would ever experience again. The wounded were evacuated by helicopter. Chinook helicopters came in to lift out casualties, flying multiple missions throughout the day. The pilots performed remarkable feats of airmanship, landing on slopes that were barely suitable for helicopters, hovering while casualties were loaded, lifting off through gaps in the jungle canopy while overloaded with wounded men and their gear. Some wounded had been waiting days for evacuation. They had been shot on the first day of fighting, treated with whatever medical supplies the battalion medics had, and then had to wait through 2 more days of combat before helicopters could reach them. Some had infections setting in from wounds that could not be properly cleaned in jungle conditions. Some had lost large amounts of blood. All of them were exhausted, dehydrated, and traumatized. The evacuation process was systematic but emotionally devastating for the soldiers who remained. Each helicopter that lifted off carried friends and fellow soldiers, some of whom would survive their wounds and eventually go home, others who would die in field hospitals despite the best efforts of military surgeons. Watching the helicopters leave, knowing you were staying on that hilltop while wounded friends were evacuated, created a complex mix of relief that they were getting help and guilt that you had survived unwounded while they had not. The dead were evacuated too, bodies wrapped in ponchos and carried to landing zones for transport back to DAC 2, and then onto graves registration. Every man killed on Hill 875 would go home to his family, but the process of recovery and identification took days. Some bodies had been lying in the jungle for 3 or 4 days before they could be recovered. The tropical heat and humidity had caused rapid decomposition. Identification required checking dog tags, dental records, and personal effects. For the soldiers who had to recover the bodies of their friends, it was one of the most difficult tasks they would ever perform. You found someone you had known, someone you had trained with and fought beside and shared meals with, and now he was dead. You wrapped him in a poncho, carried him down the hill to the landing zone, placed him on a helicopter, and watched him fly away. And then you went back to find the next body. This process continued for hours, until every American killed on Hill 875 had been accounted for. Within a week, Hill 875 was abandoned. American forces pulled out, returning to DAC 2 and other bases in the area. The hill that had cost so many lives, that had been the scene of 5 days of brutal combat, was left to the jungle. Within months, vegetation began reclaiming the scarred hilltop. Within years, you could barely tell a battle had been fought there. The question every survivor asked was, why? What was the strategic purpose of taking Hill 875? What did we accomplish that was worth 115 American lives? Major General Charles Stone, who took command of the 4th Infantry Division shortly after the battle, later described the tactics used at DAC 2 as stupid. When asked about Hill 875, he said he had the damnedest time getting anybody to show him where it was because it had absolutely no importance in the war thereafter. It had no strategic value. The fact that the enemy held mountains along the border made no difference because they controlled no people, no resources, no real growing areas. Stone questioned why American forces went out to fight the North Vietnamese, where all the advantages were on their side: remote terrain, prepared positions, proximity to sanctuaries across the border, where American forces could not pursue. The answer was that American strategy in Vietnam was based on attrition. Kill enemy forces faster than they could be replaced. Find them, fix them, destroy them. Body count was the metric of success. At Dak To, American forces claimed to have killed approximately 1,400 North Vietnamese soldiers. The cost was 376 Americans killed or missing and 1,441 wounded. The kill ratio was less than 4-1, far below what was needed to achieve the crossover point where enemy losses exceeded their ability to recruit and train replacements. And the strategic result was minimal. 3 of the 4 North Vietnamese regiments that fought at Dak To were so battered they played no part in the next phase of their offensive. But the 173rd Airborne Brigade and elements of the 4th Infantry Division were in no better shape. The 173rd had lost 1/5 of its total strength. Companies had to be rebuilt. The brigade needed months to recover combat effectiveness. 2 months after Dak To, the North Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive, attacking cities and towns throughout South Vietnam simultaneously. The border battles, including Dak To, Hue had successfully fixed American attention on remote areas, while preparations for the urban offensive proceeded undetected. The American military won the border battles tactically, but lost strategically because they focused resources on battles like Hill 875 while the real threat was developing elsewhere. For the paratroopers who fought on Hill 875, the strategic questions came later. In the moment during the battle, they were focused on survival, on doing their duty, on not letting their friends down, on taking that hill because those were their orders. The comparison to World War I is unavoidable. Frontal assaults against fortified positions, artillery preparation before infantry attacks, high casualties for limited gains, officers ordering attacks that everyone knew would be costly, and afterward, the question of whether any of it was worth the price. The difference was that in World War I, soldiers fought for national survival against an existential threat. The stakes were enormous. The sacrifice, however terrible, had purpose. At Hill 875, the stakes were a hilltop in a remote area that would be abandoned within days. The sacrifice had no clear purpose beyond demonstrating American willingness to fight. The friendly fire incident added another layer of tragedy. 42 men killed by their own aircraft. It was not the pilot's fault in any simple sense. He was trying to help. He was conducting close air support for surrounded American forces under attack. Something went wrong with the coordinates or the identification of the target or the release of the weapons. In the chaos and complexity of modern warfare, Mistakes happen. But for the families of the 42 men killed by friendly fire, knowing their loved ones were killed by American bombs rather than enemy bullets made the loss harder to bear. At least if your son or husband died fighting the enemy, there was a narrative of heroism and sacrifice. Dying from friendly fire felt senseless, preventable, a waste. Chaplain Waters' Medal of Honor citation honored his repeated acts of heroism throughout the battle. He moved among wounded soldiers under fire. He dragged casualties to safety. He provided comfort and spiritual support to dying men. He refused to seek cover when his soldiers were in danger. He embodied the selfless service that defines the best of military chaplains. His death in the friendly fire incident was a cruel irony. Killed while ministering to wounded soldiers who had been placed in the exact spot where the bomb would explode. Private First Class Lozada's Medal of Honor citation honored his actions during the North Vietnamese wave attack on the first day. He held his position with his machine gun, firing into advancing enemy soldiers, giving his company time to fall back. He was hit multiple times but kept firing until he died. His sacrifice saved the lives of fellow paratroopers. In the chaos of that first day, when the battalion was being overwhelmed, individual acts of heroism like Lozada's made the difference between survival and complete destruction. For American veterans who served in airborne units or who fought in the Central Highlands, Hill 875 is a name that carries weight. It represents the kind of battle that should not have been fought the way it was fought. Frontal assaults against prepared positions went out of fashion after World War I because the casualties were too high and the results too limited. But in Vietnam, with the emphasis on body count and aggressive action, those tactics returned. The lessons of Hill 875 were clear. Do not attack fortified positions without adequate preparation and overwhelming force. Do not commit troops to battles for terrain that has no strategic value. Do not allow the desire for high enemy body counts to override sound tactical judgment. Do not continue attacks when casualties reach levels that destroy unit cohesion and combat effectiveness. These lessons were not new. They had been learned in every war, but they were forgotten at Hill 875, relearned at tremendous cost, and then forgotten again in subsequent battles. The 173rd Airborne Brigade was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation for its actions during the Battle of Dak Tu. This is one of the highest honours a unit can receive, recognition of extraordinary heroism and performance under the most difficult conditions. The paratroopers of the 173rd earned that citation with their blood on hills like 875. But awards and citations cannot bring back the dead. They cannot heal the wounded. They cannot erase the trauma of surviving battles like Hill 875. For the men who fought there, the memories remain vivid decades later. The sound of machine gun fire, the smell of the jungle and the explosions, the faces of friends who died, the moment when the friendly firebomb exploded, the exhaustion and fear and determination to keep fighting despite everything. 57 years after the Battle of Hill 875, the hill sits in the jungle of the Central Highlands, overgrown with vegetation, unmarked except in military histories and the memories of survivors. Tourists do not visit it. There are no memorials. The local population probably does not know a battle was fought there. The jungle has reclaimed it completely. But in America, on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., the names of 115 paratroopers from the 173rd Airborne Brigade who died at Hill 875 are carved into black granite. Their names are there along with over 58,000 other Americans who died in Vietnam. Each name represents a life cut short, a family that lost a son or husband or father, a soldier who did his duty as he understood it. This is why Hill 875 matters. Not because taking the hill changed the course of the war, it did not. Not because the hill had strategic value, it did not. But because 115 men died there, and their sacrifice deserves to be remembered and understood. They climbed into machine gun fire because those were their orders. They fought with courage and determination under impossible conditions. They deserve better than to be forgotten. The paratroopers who survived Hill 875 carried the experience with them for the rest of their lives. Some processed it better than others. Some found meaning in having survived, in having done their duty, in having earned the right to be called veterans of one of the toughest battles in the war. Others struggled with survivor's guilt, with memories of friends who died, with the question of why they lived when so many others did not. All of them knew that Hill 875 was different from other battles. The sustained intensity of the fighting, the repeated assaults against fortified positions, the friendly fire disaster, the sheer brutality of 5 days trapped on a hilltop surrounded by enemy forces. It was Vietnam's version of Verdun or the Somme, a battle that ground up men and units for minimal gain. This is the legacy of Hill 875, a cautionary tale about the cost of aggressive tactics against prepared defences. A reminder that individual courage cannot overcome poor strategy. A memorial to paratroopers who climbed into machine gun fire and died doing their duty. And a question that every generation of military leaders must answer. How do we ensure that soldiers' lives are not wasted in battles for objectives that have no real value?